Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Defence Humanists AGM 2016. Defence Humanists is a section of the British Humanist Association representing serving and retired members of the armed forces, MOD, civil servants and their families. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor C Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and I've been invited to talk on the subject of what humanists must think about war. And in order to approach that in a systematic and circumstantial way, we have to be clear about what humanism is, and we've all heard about humanism, and also we need to just think a little bit about what war is, and you may have heard about war. So if we get those two things clear, we can make an approach from the standpoint of a humanist outlook. And to begin with that, humanism is a non-religious ethical outlook. An outlook, in other words, on what life matters, what life means to us in our reflection about how to live and asking and answering questions about what sort of people we should be and what kind of society we should occupy. The very key thing about humanism has been well put by someone once remarking that humanism is not an ism. That is to say, it's not a doctrine, it's not a set of do's and don'ts, it's not a set of criteria that have to be satisfied in order to count as a humanist. Rather, it's an attitude. And the attitude is, let us be at our most generous and sympathetic when we think about other people, our fellows in the human story, and let us be as creative and as thoughtful as we can be in the living of our own lives. Humanism actually has its roots in classical antiquity. When you go back and think about that great moment in the development of civilizations between about the 7th and the 5th centuries before the Common Era, you notice that the great thinkers of the time who were so influential in the Western tradition, of course Socrates and his successors in the philosophical tradition, in India, Prince Gautama, who's known as the Buddha, and in China, Confucius, and they were all near contemporaries of one another. All three of them were philosophers, not religious leaders. They didn't found religions. The Buddha asked his disciples not to make him a god and not to turn his teaching into a religion. But of course, we've all seen the life of Brian and we all know about the shoe. And so there is a natural human tendency to turn people into prophets and preachers when they didn't intend to be such. But their teachings were in their origin philosophical teachings. And philosophy for them meant very, very centrally the question of how to live, how to infuse life with purpose and with meaning. And in the case of Socrates, it was a challenge that he issued to his contemporaries to reflect on the ideas that shaped and colored the way they saw life and society. And in that lies the roots of this great humanist with a small h tradition, which has run alongside the influence of religion in the last couple of millennia and more, 2.5 millennia, and has very, very often indeed been the actual and sometimes the avowed outlook of most reflective and literate and thoughtful people. And so it is an attitude, it's not a doctrine. It doesn't tell people what to think, it tries to urge people to do some thinking, to make some serious choices, to be very reflective indeed about the kinds of values that they choose to pursue and how they're going to relate to others. So as an attitude, it doesn't close down the conversation about what your politics might be or what in detail you might think about particular crises that are happening in the moral universe around you. It leaves it open to discussion, and the hope, of course, is that people will always, in that discussion, try to adopt the one method that you remember T.S. Eliot says there is, and that one method is to be intelligent. So that is the basis, if you like, of a humanist outlook. So what would such an outlook mean for thinking about conflict, about war, about the use of force as a solution to problems in our world? Well, you may very well find among humanists pacifists. You may find among humanists people who think that there are justifications for the use of armed force at certain times for the purpose of resolving certain kinds of crises or difficulties in our world. Now, it happens just by coincidence that at this present moment, I'm writing a book about that very subject, so it's just a happy coincidence, on the three great questions which one might ask about the question of war in general. One is there an answer to be given to the question, what causes war? Why do wars happen? And the second is, what are the effects of war? And the third, of course, concerns the question about just war. And we're all very familiar with the fact that just war theory asks us to consider, are there ever justifiable grounds for going to war, and what kinds of considerations govern behavior during the course of war. So the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello points that are central to that debate. The first question about the causes of war, of course, is one which has no single answer, and there is a veritable babel of suggestions about why this is so. The least plausible of which is that it's because human beings, and mainly the male version of human beings, are aggressive and are prone to resort to violence to solve problems. And then parallels are drawn with chimpanzees who, as you know, male chimpanzees get together in gangs and go and attack other chimpanzee gangs. And there is this idea that somehow or other innate aggression is part of the human makeup. But there are two things to be said about that, merely to raise a question mark, because it's a complex issue and I'm not suggesting that I have an answer to it. But two things immediately strike me, and that is that most of what happens during the course of a full-blown war, and let's take the example of the Second World War as a focus for attention here. Most of what happens during the course of a war is very non-violent. A great deal of planning, a lot of work in factories, a lot of logistics going on, a lot of transport, a lot of lorries, a lot of putting together uniforms and getting together food and poring over maps and making plans. Now try to do those things in an aggressive frame of mind and you're quite likely not to do it very well. So you might actually, if you were to work out proportions, recognize that maybe 90% or so of what happens during war tends to have to happen in a reasonably calm frame of mind. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to carry out the sharp end of it, the bit which is very noisy and destructive, very well. So it may very well be that war, as the cliche has it, as a episode or series of events of great violence and destructiveness, of death, of maiming, of injury of individuals, and these things, of course, do happen, is somehow the major content of a state of war. And the fact is that it isn't. So when you think about elderly gentlemen, as in the case of the First and Second World War, sitting around cabinet tables and deciding to go to war, it's not that they are all foaming at the mouth and gnashing their teeth either. There, too, one imagines a certain degree of calm reflection. So the idea that the cause of war is the aggressive instinct that makes us leap out of our barroom chair and punch somebody on the nose, well, it can't really be like that. So it's obviously got to be a much, much more complicated thing. And when you look at the vast amount of literature there is indeed on the question of the causes of war, you find that there is quite a lot of consensus among at least many commentators around the idea that chief among the causes of war are social, political, international factors. The way societies are organized, the way international relations work, competition for resources. In the past, it may very well have been the case that people went to war in order to accumulate resources by capturing more territory or more people, whereas the abrasions that happen between nation states or between interest blocks in the world can be very fertile in causes of conflict. And the use of of force as a way of resolving difficulties always, of course, marks a certain kind of failure, the failure of other means to resolve disputes and difficulties between nation states. So whatever the answer is, and there will be a plurality of answers really about the causes of war, there's not going to be any one particular answer, and it may very well not be because human beings are somehow prone to violence or to aggression. We might be when you're in your car and you're suffering road rage because somebody else's perceived misbehavior on the road, or when there are two options of what happens in a pub in the evening. One is that you get smarter as the evening goes by and more deeply philosophical, and the other is that you get more irritated by other people's behavior, and aggression may play a role in the latter of those. But to think that war is the result of a natural propensity to aggression cannot be anywhere near the whole story. And the second reason for thinking that is that look at the effect of combat or involvement in the very sharp end of conflict on human individuals. If war, if aggression, if the desire to fight were somehow an important part of human nature, why are people so desperately traumatized by the experience of war? Why is it that people are so upset by death and by destruction and by the horror of actual sharp-end conflict? And when we look at the emerging literature and understanding in psychiatry, for example, from the First World War onwards, about trauma and the kind of stress that follows trauma, we see that rather on the contrary, human nature is not something which is attuned to or very much likes the fact of violence and destruction and aggression. There was one claim made after the First World War, actually, that in the Kitchener armies, among conscripts as opposed to volunteers, conscript forces tended to be relatively ineffective because such large percentages of the conscripted troops on the front line were ineffective. They wouldn't point their guns at the enemy. They would delope or just freeze up and not be able to cope. And that the people who could cope and who were effective on the front lines tended to have profiles rather similar in a way to recidivists, that is, people who weren't as troubled by memories of horrible things happening as the majority of the population. Volunteers, of course, in our armed forces now comprised of volunteers, so people who have made a conscious decision about an involvement in something that could involve those very traumatic endeavors. And the psychological preparedness for that is very different from the preparedness or lack of it on the part of people who've been dragooned into a military force to serve at the sharp end. So you would expect a very different result there. But the overall point is, if this were somehow natural to us as human beings, if fighting, aggression, destruction, causing death and witnessing it, if this were a natural feature of our lives, we would expect people to be rather less traumatized by it than in fact they are. So I just mentioned those two things about the relatively peaceful nature of most activity in war, the logistical and preparatory aspect of it, and the fact of trauma, to suggest that it's a bit too easy to attribute to a factor in human nature the sources of war in our societies. On the question of the effects of war, one of the very unhappy things about war is that it tends to speed up social change, industrial change, and technological change. In 1939, the Royal Air Force was still flying Gloucester Gladiators. Of course, the early Spitfires and Hurricanes were coming on stream, but there were Gloucester Gladiators, biplanes, still in service in 1939. In 1945, the Whittle jet had come into service. You think about the fact that the Germans were sending missiles, unmanned rockets, and indeed in the case of V-2s, you might even regard them as guided missiles. So, you know, the Second World War really speeded up technological development. You think about the war as, in fact, an industrial and technological race between the two opposing sides, the Allies and the Axis powers. And you realize, therefore, that times of urgency and emergency really do speed things up and move things on. Society was dramatically impacted by the First World War and the Second World War. Think about the consequences of the fact that very, very large numbers of women went to work in factories during the First World War because of the very large numbers of men who had been conscripted into the armies. And it was impossible to go back to an Edwardian dispensation and set of attitudes after this very sharp change had happened. So war brings about very great changes. Somebody once remarked about Switzerland, rather unkindly, that 400 years of peace in Switzerland had produced the cuckoo clock. And this is the idea that so somehow times of peace are times of habit, of repetition, of stagnation, whereas times of emergency are times of very great change. That idea is, unfortunately, one which has a rather large measure of truth to it. You look back at the 17th century, at the very heart of the 17th century in Europe, the most devastating war that Europe had ever experienced at that point, the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, saw, as a century, saw immense changes, really huge changes, not just in technological respects or in social respects, but actually in the very mindset of humanity. An educated, literate person in the year 1600 who stepped out of doors on a clear evening and looking up at the sky would have seen the spheres of heaven, the sun, the moon, the planets and stars revolving around planet Earth. We are at the very center of things, and maybe even if you were a person of faith, you would think you were at the pinnacle of things as well, so far as creation went. By 100 years later, the year 1700, if you stepped out of doors on a clear night and looked at the sky, you would see vast, immeasurable distances, the stars so remote from us, each one of them a sun, maybe with planets going around them. To say at the beginning of the century that we were not at the center of the universe would have got you burned at the stake, as happened to Giordano Bruno in Rome in the year 1600, to Lucilio Vanini in Toulouse in 1619. But in 1686, a man called Bernard de Bouvier de Fontenelle was able to publish a book called On the Plurality of Worlds, in which he fully adopted and publicly avowed the Copernican view that we are not at the center of the universe, and he did it unscathed. Had no anxiety that he would be arrested by the Inquisition and put to death. Now, something was happening in the 17th century that was causing a tremendous change of mind. Let me give you another illustration of this. In 1606, the play Macbeth was staged in the Whitehall Palace in London before James I and his court. And it was a very, very topical play because less than 9 months before, there had been a terrorist attempt to blow up the king and Parliament. This was the Guy Fawkes plot, a bunch of Catholic terrorists. I would say plus change, okay, except it's not quite that religion any longer. They just terrorize us in different ways. But there they were, trying to blow up the king and Parliament in November of 1605. So it was a very, very topical play because it was about the killing of a king, about the murder of a king. And one thing that Shakespeare could happily rely on was that the audience watching this play would have recognized that the killing of a king is not merely a crime, it is a blasphemy, because kings rule by divine right. The king is the regent of the deity on earth. Now, in 1649, 43 years later, from the very same building, Charles I was marched out onto a scaffold and had his head chopped off. And nobody in the crowds watching this event, some of whom must have been at the premiere of that play 43 years before, thought that the world was being turned upside down. Remember in Macbeth, Macbeth himself thought before the murder of Duncan that the horses might eat one another in the stables and that the graves would open and the ghosts of the dead would emerge at midnight, that the owl would fall on the falcon instead of the other way around, so that everything was upside down. But nothing was upside down in 1649 except the idea of monarchy itself. Now, these are just little examples of major changes that were taking in the mindset of this century against the background of this terrible war, a war that was so destructive that it is said 1 out of every 3 German-speaking people in the center of the continent of Europe died, either directly or indirectly, because of the war. And the amount of destruction, the villages and towns that were burned to the ground, the destruction of agricultural property, was said to have been very like Germany in 1945. That was the degree of destruction. 30 years of armies going backwards and forwards across Europe, this monumental struggle between the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs on the one hand, and the Protestant states of Europe on the other, mainly, although France, despite being a nominally Catholic country, had sided with the Protestant cause because they wanted to try to limit the Habsburg power. But nevertheless, it was fundamentally a war of religion, and it was a very, very destructive war. But the awful fact that wars speed things up not only made the development of artillery and strategy and so on really speed up, but also the breakdown of controls in Europe. The fact that border posts no longer had guards on them meant that people and letters could travel around Europe, and the exchange of ideas helped enormously the efflorescence of science and of philosophy and of culture. The scientific and philosophical revolution of the 17th century was potentiated by the fact of war and the breakdown of controls in society. What we are witnessing today in the Middle East is something which has uncanny similarities to that episode in Europe in the 17th century, in the following sense. What you're seeing today in the Middle East is a really awful, tragic internecine conflict within Islam itself, within Muslim-majority countries, where Sunni and Shia are struggling with one another. A lot of what is happening, of course, is proxy for the enmity between the Saudis on the Sunni side and Iran on the Shia side. But it is a devastating event, and the terrorism that sometimes afflicts European and North American countries in the last couple of decades has been a kind of splashover, a sort of byblow of this dreadful implosion that's happening in the Islamic world as it struggles with itself over its confrontation with modernity and secularism in the rest of the world. And this conflict in the 17th century Europe was a conflict of ideas. Remember that the Church of Rome was trying, like Keynote, to stop the rising tide of thought and investigation. It burned people at the stake. It put Galileo on trial. In fact, the trial of Galileo was the last great moment when they really tried to stop things. And in a way, what we might be witnessing in the Islamic world at the moment is a desperate struggle to retain traditional ways of thinking against the pressures that are making it very difficult to sustain that. Of course, there are many disanalogies as well, but it is rather uncanny to see this happening. And no doubt, like the 17th century, like the Second World War, like all moments of great stress and change, don't forget that even the rise of classical civilization back in the 5th century, before the Common Era, was the result of a monumental struggle there too, the Persian invasions of the Greek world and the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE. So when you look back at times of great change and innovation and a rapid leap forward, they tend to be times of conflict. So one of the effects of war is great change. And in amongst that change, there will be, at very least, technological development of one kind or another. And it may very well be that sometimes, too, the insufferable nature of war, the unacceptability of the political and social structures that have brought war about, make people determined to change their societies. Again, this happened in 1945 with the landslide victory for the Labour Party, which brought in the welfare state and so on. So you can see that war is very consequential. When people go to war, they can have no confidence in what the outcome is going to be. We'll remember when King Croesus of Lydia consulted the oracle about whether or not he should go to war with Persia. The oracle said to him, "If you go to war with Persia, you will destroy a great empire." He thought, oh, brilliant. He went off to war, and it was his own empire that was destroyed. And that is a lesson, of course, that really needs to be remembered. And then the third point, the point about just war theory, and thinking about whether it is ever justified to go to war. And of course, this is really the key point for us this afternoon. I think that the second part, which is about just behavior in war, sort of speaks for itself. I got into a bit of trouble a few years ago writing a book called Among the Dead Cities, in which I said that the bomber commands, that the attacks on German cities during the Second World War and the attacks by the United States Army Air Force on Japanese cities, especially the dropping of the atomic bombs, were not justified. Now, this is a very, very complicated story, and it is one that does get one into trouble a little bit. The 5th Group in Bomber Command, which, as you know, was staffed mainly by Canadians who had a very, very high casualty rate as a result of the bombing campaigns, were particularly upset by the fact that I had argued that, in retrospect, it was the one thing that we did during the Second World War that we should be least proud of, against the premise that this was a war that was justified, in my view. We had to defeat Nazism, and we had to defeat Japanese aggression. But then the great question is, does that justify everything we did during the course of the war? Does it justify indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations night after night for years? Well, you will know that in 1949, the 4th Geneva Convention on Conduct of War wanted to include a clause outlawing indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations. And both the United Kingdom and the United States refused to allow that clause to be incorporated, since both of them had just been doing it big time during the course of the Second World War. 1976, 2 protocols were added to that convention, the first of which does outlaw indiscriminate attacks on civilians. And the United Kingdom is a signatory to that protocol. To this day, the United States is not. Interestingly, Israel is a signatory of that protocol, which is why, before it attacks Hezbollah, it drops leaflets warning the civilians in the area to clear out of the way, although it's very Pickwickian, because, of course, that's not going to happen. But it is an attempt to try to at least pay lip service to something which is now part of received international law on these matters. But if you think about just action in war, you think about the fact that people were conscious during the Second World War of the questionable nature of indiscriminate bombing of civilian centres. The Bishop of Chichester said in the House of Lords, he said, "We're fighting barbarians." This is 1943. "Why are we behaving like them?" It's a really interesting question, that one, because it brings home, right in the middle of a desperate struggle as the Second World War was, that these ethical questions can be very live for people reflecting on conduct in war. Way, way back in the mists of antiquity, when the Mahabharata was being composed and assembled, the great poem in that tradition, questions about how you treat the enemy, the wounded, prisoners, were live questions. In the Mahabharata, we're told you mustn't kill somebody whose back is turned towards you. You mustn't kill somebody who is wounded. You must take care of the prisoners that you've taken from the enemy. There was a famous Duke of Chu in China who was urged by his lieutenants when his forces were ready but the opposing forces were not. They hadn't broken camp and got into their battle order. And he said, "A gentleman doesn't attack the enemy when they're not ready." That's not something which anybody now interested in tactics and strategy would ever possibly think. But he waited until they were ready and then got walloped. And afterwards, when he was taken prisoner, he said, "Well, anyway, at least I behaved like a gentleman, even though I lost the battle." So you can see that thinking about just action in war has been with us pretty well as long as war has been with us, I suppose. And the idea that we should be humane in our treatment of prisoners and wounded enemy is, I think, now widely accepted. So it's the other question, the question about, is it ever justified to go to war? Well, some of you here will be conscious of the fact that just war theory has its roots in the thinking of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. And there is a great deal of self-congratulation on the part of Christians, of course, since St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas are big names in the Christian tradition, that thinking about just war is something that was started by them. But of course, the reason why they thought about it is as follows. Christianity is a pacifist outlook. Turn the other cheek, love your enemies. Blessed are the peacemakers. So when Christianity became the official religion of a highly militarized empire, the Roman Empire, a bit of wriggle room was required to justify going to war and not turning your cheek and loving your enemies. And this was provided by the thinking of Augustine and Aquinas. So it's a rather interesting source, a rather interesting route for this kind of thinking. And in a way, the oddity about the just war theory that has its roots in that is that it mixes up prudential and moral considerations. I mean, as you know, if you've read about this stuff, as you certainly have, among the grounds that would justify going to war are that you can win it. And that the actions that you take would be proportional to winning it, which might mean, actually, that if you have a very powerful enemy, well, you should use your nuclear weapons. It's got to be proportional to winning it, since winning is a justification, or a capability of winning a war is a justification for going to war, and so on. Those are the prudential considerations. Moral ones are that you go to war in order to remedy some great wrong or to protect yourself. And the idea is that the planned outcome of the war must be one which is morally defensible. It's not that you want to take somebody else's land or to capture all their women or to steal their resources, but that things will be better after the war than they were before. That has to be part of the plan. And as we've already noticed, that is not something that anybody can guarantee. But it seems to me that in revising and updating just war theory, one can recognize the prudential considerations as being just part of the normal common sense attitude that one might take to whether it's sensible to go to war, not whether it's justified to go to war, but that there are two cases where it's quite hard to see how to accept the pacifist approach. And let me just preface this by saying that I think, and I feel it to be consistent with my own commitment to humanism, that one should be as pacifist as one can be, as close to being a pacifist as one can be, without being suicidal or without failing in a duty to our fellows in the human story, in the following two ways. Self-defense, if you really seriously, deeply, and genuinely believe in the values by which you and your community live, and somebody attacks you, and you have every reason to think that the person attacking your society is quite likely to subvert those values and impose ones that you don't share. So, for example, resisting invasion by the Nazis in 1940 seemed to me to be a perfectly justifiable thing to do, because whatever the contrast, whatever the state of play in the UK of 1940 might have been, it was, I think, very, very much preferable to the state of play in Nazi Germany. And so that by itself would have been a justification for resisting and for using force in defense. The other consideration is our responsibility for our fellows in the human story. One very significant little moment in recent history was the tremendous atrocity that took place in Rwanda, Burundi, with the Tutsis and the Hutus. You may remember the awful atrocities there, the massacring of one group by the other. And nobody intervened. No UN force went in there, no power competent in the sense of having the resources, the facilities, the technology, the manpower, the know-how. Nobody went in to stop it. And afterwards, there was a lot of bruised sensibility on the part of people thinking in NATO and the West in general about this. I think it was President Clinton who said, we, meaning the West, have failed in our duty to go in and stop a terrible atrocity, which we could have done had we taken action, and that was a failing on our part. Now that episode and the thinking that followed it played a major role in what decisions were taken about the Kosovo crisis, as you may remember. There, it was decided that intervention was necessary, because to see something similar to what had happened in Rwanda, Burundi, seemed to people unacceptable. That when we see a stronger force beating up on a weaker force. It's like witnessing bullying in the school playground. The idea that we should take some kind of police-like action to try to step in and stop it and to protect people who are in danger, that becomes something of an imperative. And I think that some of that thinking, let's step in there and let's do something about this, played an unfortunate role in the Second Iraq War, or in the run-up to the Second Iraq War. Although that might have been more complex, it may even have been, if you don't want to defend anybody who made decisions about getting involved, but it would almost certainly have been an extremely bad thing, more dangerous thing, if the United States under the last President Bush had gone in to Iraq for a second time absolutely without any allies. And you may remember there was a major diplomatic effort prior to the invasion of Iraq to try to get together what came to be called the Coalition of the Willing, you may remember, to get together a number of different states involved, so it looked like an international effort and not just a solo effort by the United States. And I think it would have been a terrible, an even worse disaster if that hadn't actually happened. And part of the motivation for that must have been, we have the ability, let's get in there and make a difference. Let's get in there and change or protect or do something. And so you could see the bookends of the Hutu and Tutsi atrocities and the Second Iraq invasion as being, well, we failed to do something there, and then we got it into our heads that we should do something, and then we did it in the wrong place and at the wrong time. So you could see this as a moment in the history of the use of force, either the failure in one direction or the failure in the other, as being something that teaches us a very great deal about justification for going to war, justification for using force. One doesn't, however, want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this matter. If one thought, well, we failed to intervene and then we over-intervened, and so, where do we find the balance and how do we organize things properly? What one wouldn't want to do is to say, leave other people's problems to themselves. Let's just put them into some kind of purdah, let them sort it out, fight it out. And you remember what Bertrand Russell says, that wars never show who's right, they only show who's left when the war is over. So just leave them to get on with it and see what happens there. But to find the balance and to have a very clear and a very cogent and well thought through case for intervening in some circumstances, not intervening in others, would seem to be the intelligent way to go on this. So there you would be left with the thought that self-defense, if you felt that the structures and the values of a society that you belong to are worth defending, and it is important to defend them against a completely different way of thinking about things, that self-defense would make the use of force justified, and that intervention would sometimes be justified when it is a situation writ large which is like bullying, like one entity really imposing itself and committing atrocities against another entity. So those two cases, I think you could make a case for saying they're justified. Look back across the landscape of the history of war and ask how many such wars were really justified. Was the First World War justified? Is there a consensus to say that it should never have happened? There was no justification for it on anybody's part. Look back at the Napoleonic Wars. What was that about? Well, the monarchies of Europe had ganged up against the French because they had made themselves a republic, and then they ganged up against Napoleon because he had made himself an emperor. What they wanted to do, you may remember, the great justification at the end of the Napoleonic Wars was the restitution of the legal entitlement of monarchies. And this was a question now, when we look back at it, that we might want to answer very differently. You look back at the reasons for the wars of religion in France in the 16th century and the 30 Years' War in the 17th. What was the justification for them? Once again, none of these wars, and they were all major wars, seem to have been justified. They should never have happened. And the wars that where we do feel that there was a justification, you might want to say we were justified in fighting against Nazism 1939, 1940, but that war should never have happened because the war that made it happen should never have happened, namely the First World War. And so you can go back through the complexities of history, but at a certain point, You have to ask yourself whether you're going to take the safety catch off and point your weapon at somebody who's on the other side of some argument, and whether it's justified to pull the trigger. That is the very key issue that any thoughtful and considerate person would want to ask. Is there a clear, thoughtful case which provides us with justification for engaging in this tremendously destructive and dangerous and upsetting thing, which is armed conflict, and in what circumstances are the criteria for that met? So a humanist, and I conclude on this point now, a humanist, I think, would say, and it is a possible humanist position. I've already remarked that there may very well be many humanists who, because of their humanism, feel that pacifism, that it's better in the long term for humanity in general, that even in the face of a threat like a Nazi invasion, that you shouldn't resist, and that non-resistance is a different kind of resistance, and you might be able to change minds and change hearts and change the course of history by not resisting. That's a possible position. But it is also a possible position for a humanist to say, just because you're a humanist, you're not a milksop. So if you really believe in something and you're prepared to stand up for it, that might sometimes have consequences where you have to do some very unpleasant things. I mean, it's a bit like going into a hospital for an operation. That's an unpleasant thing, but you know, there might be very good justifications for it. And similarly, to stand by when you have the capacity to help people who are being, in effect, being bullied, that raises serious question marks as well. What do we owe to our neighbours in the human story? And surely there is at least the question, don't we have a duty sometimes to go to these extreme measures in extreme circumstances? So that is a possible position for a humanist to take as well, and it happens to be the one that I take. Thank you very much. Well, I think we have time for questions, comments, and complaints.
Yes, so thank you very much, and if anybody has some questions, we have got about 25 minutes, I would think, so go ahead.
Yes.
Can I ask in relation to your, the self-defence argument that you put forward? Mm-hmm. You used the example of Nazi Germany and seemed to suggest that you could defend yourself against a country that was coming into yours because their regime was worse than what existed in your country. What about if the country, Germany as it was then, actually turned out to be quite good lads, but they weren't going to impose their Nazism upon you? Does a country not have a right to simply defend itself against another country?
To get the purport of your question right in just a moment, one thing I thought that you were going to say is, does the a doctrine of the justification of self-defense allow you to act preemptively? So you attack a country which you think might be just about to attack you in self-defense, so that you just make sure that you don't suffer any of the consequences they do. And that, of course, provides a big fig leaf for people who want to invade other people's countries. They say, well, we invaded them because we thought they were going to invade us. And then you have to be very careful, because that raises a whole different question, which is about authenticity, the sincerity with which something is done, and the grounds and justifications you have for it. But to go back to your point, it actually happens that, at any rate, in the rhetoric of the Nazi Party in the late 1930s, there was no stated intention to go to war with the UK or with the British Empire or with the United States. And indeed, Hitler was extremely annoyed that the British government had declared war in September 1939, because he thought, let them have their overseas empire, I want to establish a continental empire. And anyway, the Anglo-Saxons are sort of subset of some northern German tribe, so why can't they just see themselves as being our natural allies? And so it might have been, and these counterfactual questions, might have been that if we hadn't declared war in 1939 and Hitler had taken over the rest of Europe, we would have been left alone, and we would now just be an extension of Britain in the 1930s. But it didn't work out that way. I don't know whether you know that there were all sorts of little peculiarities and glitches that temporarily, for a very brief period, the United Kingdom and France were one country, were one state. We were actually officially united as one state for about 9 days. Did you know this?
Yeah, that was long.
Say again? What?
That was long enough.
Yeah, it was long enough, was it? Oh dear, I can see we've got a pro-European here. And that was because the UK government, and at the urging indeed of Churchill, was convinced that if the Nazi ideology became established as a continuing state presence in the world, it would ultimately be very destructive. And this is something that he'd seen and thought for a long time. He'd been arguing in Parliament for a number of years, all the way through appeasement, all the way through the very tremendous efforts that people like Chamberlain and others had made to keep peace. You know, we now look back on Chamberlain and we sneer at the idea of appeasement and think it's weak. But, you know, for people who had witnessed or who had actually been in the trenches in the First World War, the thought of another war was just too horrifying. It was just too much, and they were desperate to try and keep peace in Europe. The whole question of self-defense becomes very tricky when you put yourself into the mindset of people thinking, as it might be in 1938 or in the summer of 1939, about the international situation, of all the different possibilities, all the different ways that it could play out. What do? There would have been people, and I'm sure there were people, who took the view that it would have been justified to preempt, to take action in advance. I mean, go back to the late, in the period immediately after the First World War. You may remember that the Royal Flying Corps had become very big. By 1918, it was the biggest air force in the world. And it had become the Royal Air Force against the wishes of the Army and Navy, who wanted to absorb the air wing back under their own control. And the people who had been running things in the RFC wanted the new Air Force to be an independent entity. And the people at the top of the Air Force at that time were trying to persuade government by saying to them, the next war is going to be a bombing war, and it will be very short. And it will be whichever country, as the two countries, and they thought naturally it would be England and France, as they bombed one another, it will be whichever country has the greater resolution to put up with bombing, which the RAF at that time thought would, of course, be us, because the French are much more lily-livered than we are, so they wouldn't be able to... You know, all sorts of crazy things have been thought. You'd be absolutely amazed when in the Second World War, there were a lot of discussions about what to do about Germany when the war was over. Germany had been united by Bismarck just, back towards the end of the 19th century, and it had already caused 2 world wars. So what's to do with Germany? It's obviously a danger. It's too big, it's too strong, and it's too militaristic in its ethos, in its society. So one very, very senior member of the United States cabinet suggested sterilizing all German males. Isn't that horrible, kind of eugenic proposal? A second, much, much better proposal was that all young Germans should be taken and dispersed around the British Empire, taught to play cricket, then sent back, and then they would behave themselves. It was a serious suggestion, absolutely serious suggestion. And the suggestion that was eventually adopted was that Germany should be split in 2. It should become 2 countries, which would weaken both the halves of the countries, and that actually happened. And to begin with, and this was actually accepted by Churchill and Roosevelt at a conference in Toronto in 1943, that Germany should be deindustrialized. And it was John Maynard Keynes who said to Churchill, if you do that, you're going to have a dead man tied to your ankle. So you've got to allow it to remain an industrialized country, just for economic reasons. But the splitting of the country, that was something that they did decide to do. So, the crazy things that people think and plan to do. But in the 1920s, the whole thinking about war was that wars would be short, very violently destructive, because there would be bombing wars, and it would just simply be a matter of national resolution as to whether you could put up with that.
Yeah.
Why why did the Second World War become noted as a just war? Because up in 1939, the question of the horrors that were found later on, the concentration camps, that was not known.
Well, a great philosophical answer to that question, yes and no. I mean, I think there was quite a lot of understanding of the difficulties that the Jewish population of Germany was facing all the way through the 1930s, actually. Kristallnacht and the dispossession of Jewish business owners and people leaving, and then, of course, the Kindertransport and so on. So actually there was quite a lot of awareness of racism. The rhetoric that came out of Hitler's mouth and out of the mouth of his senior Nazi party colleagues about Jews, about Slavs, and their desire for Lebensraum, and then the activity, the Anschluss of Austria and taking over Bavaria and in the whole of the Czech Republic, and then the attack on Poland. I mean, it was perfectly clear that this was an aggressive, dangerous, and the rhetoric was horrible and unacceptable. Unfortunately, of course, there were a lot of people here and in other parts of Europe as well who agreed with some of that stuff. You know, anti-Semitism was a kind of reflex at that time. You may remember that horrible line in one of T.S. Eliot's poems where he's talking about Venice, the rats beneath the piles and the Jews beneath the lot. I mean, that was something that at that time, when that poem was published in the 1920s or whenever, nobody, was horrified by it. It was just a kind of reflex remark. So the mindset of the world at the time was not as antipathetic to Nazi rhetoric in all sectors of society as it is now, but people were certainly aware of it. Yeah.
Where do you go in a situation where you don't believe you're under threat and you don't believe that there'll be a catastrophe if you don't intervene against somebody else, but one of your allies does believe that? Where in the hierarchy of justness, if you like, do you put intervention because you've signed up with an ally to help out where they feel it's necessary?
Yes, I mean that poses exactly the kind of difficulty and dilemma that must often be felt by allies when their allies, really got the bit between their teeth about something. The very nature of a dilemma is that there are reasons on both sides that are very compelling in both directions. That's exactly why it's a dilemma, why it's very hard to decide what to do. And given the incalculability of consequences, it makes it even more difficult to do when people are going to die and you're going to be using weapons. So it's a very good question, and it can only be answered on a case-by-case basis. This is one of those, in fact, there are many such situations when you think about the great problem of war. And, let's take a step back and just remind ourselves of something. How many years, centuries it takes to build things up, and how you can bomb it in a matter of seconds, how you can destroy things of great, very, very great value that have been the accumulation of human endeavor over very long periods of time. So these are desperate decisions that people have to take. And the reasons, therefore, for getting involved in it have to be very compelling reasons and can only be case-by-case reasons. This is one of those situations where you can't have a general rule. You really have to look at the detail.
You suggested that self-defense and intervention as motivations for just war. And argue that there are elements of both of those going on today in terms of Syria and ISIS. Do you think that we as British humanists should be sanguine about what our country's doing? And I don't want to be politically controversial here, but just at a sort of academic level. Should we be sanguine about what we're being asked to do?
No, I think the advisable thing is always to be troubled by what's happening, even if you think, well, actually, you think about the Kurds and the danger, or the Yazidi, for example, and the real atrocities that have been committed against them, especially against Yazidi women, and it makes you think, I'd really like to get in there and punch a few noses myself. And so there you may feel that taking some action is a duty, not merely something justified. But in a case like this, and the whole situation in Syria and Iraq is so messy, that I'm asking the question, what should one be doing? Now we know that British and US special forces are much involved there. We know that the use of air power can't be a complete solution to the problem, although it's no doubt a big help. We've burned our fingers on arming people who have subsequently turned around to bite us. I mean, that happened with arming the fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union when that was the proxy war, and then we left weaponry in the hands of the people who became jihadis afterwards, and now we're fighting them and they're shooting us with our own guns and so on. So, all the complexities of the situation are tremendous. How you help in a situation has to be something that scrupulous planning and thought and consideration has to go into. And the very scrupulousness of it means delay, and it means that people like ISIS get an advantage while you're still working out how you're going to fight them. It may very well be, and here is an unhappy fact, a really, really unhappy thought. The reason that Nazism was, and the whole project of German militaristic expansionism came to a very shuddering halt in 1945, was that the defeat of Germany was total. Germany was absolutely hammered. The population, the material fabric, the whole structure of Germany, its industrial base, everything was completely hammered, and it had to be rebuilt pretty well from the ground up. The victory over Germany and Japan in both cases was overwhelming. Now, when the invasion of Iraq occurred in 2002, under Rumsfeld, the Rumsfeldian doctrine was, let's get in there and beat the Iraqi army and leave the fabric of Iraqi society intact. Well, what was the result? If you leave things intact, if you leave weaponry intact, if soldiers can change into civilian clothes and melt into the population and then start an insurgency later on, what you've failed to do is to, as it were, clear the ground of the enemy. You just haven't done it, and you've just created resentment and left in place all the structures that could come back and cause what has, as it's turned out to be, a suppurating chronic case of continuing civil and other kinds of war. So somebody who was just brutal about this would have said, if you're going to invade Iraq, you've got to go in there and absolutely flatten it to the ground so that there's no comeback, there's no possibility of anybody rising up and causing an insurgency. So the very unhappy lesson that we learn from this is that if you're going to do this, do it. Don't do it with one hand tied behind your back or with any scruples or something. And of course, that kind of advice is horrifying. I mean, does one really want to do that? If somebody had said to President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, this is the only way that you can really solve this problem, would they have been prepared to do it? No, they thought they could do it on the cheap and, in the minimalist fashion. Just beat the army and then everything else is going to be okay. And the population will rise up and be pleased that we did it. Turned out that they weren't.
Do you think a preemptive strike could be justified or justifiable?
Yes, it can. I mean, there are cases where, you know that your enemy is developing a nuclear weapon and their intent in using it against you, and time is running out and so on, and you're thinking about protecting your population and yourself, there might be a very clear-cut case where you might do it. But as I said earlier, the idea of self-defense by preemption is a terrible fig leaf. It's an excuse that anybody could use to do anything. And that's why I invoked the concept of authenticity. This has to be a genuine, authentic, and very sincerely conceived matter. It has to be true that you're in imminent danger and that if you don't do anything, you're going to be zapped. And then you've got a justification for doing it. But boy, you'd have to be very, very careful because, you could imagine Mr. Putin using the preemptive argument to invade just about anybody he wanted to.
And it's caused a lot of problems with in Israel's history where they've been quite preemptive, but then to my understanding, have perpetuated a bit of a cycle of violence.
Yeah. Well, again, you see, I think in a lot of conflicts now, we have this very strange situation where the mightiest military in the world, the United States military, is pinned down and held down and given a very, very bad time because of asymmetric forms of conflict. That small groups of insurgents who really know the ground and who have no fear of death, they're going to get their 72. Somebody said raisins is the true translation of that term. That would be very bad news for them if it turned out to be true. But so they can hold down a mighty military machine, and so the way wars are fought now, and the way you think about preemption, and the way you and the scrupulousness with which you try to do it. So you're trying to stay just on the line of international norms about behavior in conflict. And I suppose, I don't know because I haven't really looked at it enough, but I've noticed that in some cases the Israeli Defense Force has taken action in Lebanon and in the Gaza Strip, which they've claimed to be preemptive. They're striking against sources of rockets into Israel. And they try to do it in a way that they claim is proportional and it's directed just at the insurgents and so on. But of course, they cause a huge amount of collateral damage. And this concept of collateral damage, which means babies and children and women and so on being killed in these things, is in itself another great big fig leaf. So it's a very, very messy and difficult situation. And they could solve the problem by going in there and zapping everybody. Again, it could be the 1945 solution, just, flat earth policy, and then that solves the problem once for all. But if you pick away at it and you try to stay this side of international law and you have your justifications, and you're never going to really close that wound. It's just going to keep on bleeding. That is a problem.
Yeah.
Given the current nature of our perceived enemies and the fundamental extremists that we're kind of fighting, certainly in the Middle East at the moment with no borders, and the British way of dealing with it seems to be moving towards more secular society, and that's how we're kind of fighting it. And the American side of things, they're going more religious. My question is, how concerned are you about Donald Trump?
At the moment, it's just a fog of bemusement that he's got as far as he has. And you wonder how the heck that's happened, If he became president, well, good God, I just hope that there would be enough sensible people around him to keep his hands off any buttons that he happened to be in control of. It is terribly worrying, actually, when you see the polarization, political, ideological, religious, and other polarizations have been very dramatic in the last couple of decades, haven't they? This raises a great question about the overall strategy of how to deal with a world which has become so conflicted with itself in so many ways and so many levels. Just look at the political situation in the United States of America. You look at the gulf between Democrats and Republicans in a constitutional setting which actually relies upon bipartisanship. The whole structure of the American Constitution with the White House and Congress and the Supreme Court really relied on the possibility of there being compromises and negotiations. And with the GOP becoming so extreme, the Tea Party, and so angry about how the world is going, that's now broken down, even to the point where the United States government runs out of money in 1 minute before midnight and needing trillions of dollars. And it's an embarrassment for them and a terrible situation. And that's just one of many different kinds of polarizations. And the religious polarization, so between people who have faith and people who don't, between different faiths, and of course there the opposition is even more dramatic, as we see between the Sunnis and between the Shiite and all the sub-Shiite, because there are 62 different sects in Islam, like Alawites and various others. And this fragmentation of one part, the minority part of Islam, is a source of running conflict. And that conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India, between Muslims and Christians in Pakistan, as we've seen recently, the whole thing is fragmenting in a very bad way. So we're faced with a difficulty, and the solution to the difficulty is by no means easy to specify, but one important part of it has to be that opportunity for jobs, economic opportunity, the opportunity to live a life of which is more flourishing and peaceful, has to be part of the story. There have to be other kinds of solutions, systemic, social, economic solutions, which make the push towards conflict and violence less of an option for people. A book has just been published, and unfortunately I don't have the title and author, two authors just on my tongue at the moment, but it's a book which asks the question, why are so many Islamic terrorists engineers? It asks this question, a very high proportion of Islamic terrorists have been engineers, and it addresses the question of the education level of people who have been known to take part in terrorist atrocities. And the answer that drops out of it is one that you feel has to be the right answer, and that is that in a lot of Middle Eastern countries where the economies are stuttering along and have been dependent on military aid, billions of dollars from the US, as in Egypt, for example, for such a long time, there are just no jobs. There's just no opportunities for people. And they become very disaffected. If you're a young male, you're educated, you may have traveled, you may have had part of your education abroad, you may have seen what life is like there, and you compare it to life back at home. You may have been tempted by what you've seen in the West and even indulged, drunk a few beers and smoked a few cigarettes and slept with a few girls and so on. Then you come back to your own society, feel the tension and the difficulty of making anything out of life, and so you become angry. And this is one trajectory that they describe. But the overall suggestion is that lack of opportunity, the higher unemployment levels, the fact that in the Middle East the average age is extremely low of the population at large, the very big young population, that this is fertile ground for disaffection, anger, resentment. And you might have millions of people who feel that way, and it will only take a few thousand to pick up a gun in order to express their resentment and anger, and you've got a problem.
Do you think the justification arguments change when you look in the cyber environment rather than kind of physical warfare?
Well, that's a very, very, very interesting question. In fact, we do tend to overlook the fact that there is already a war in cyberspace with hacking and disruption of communications and sort of government computing potential and so on. And there is another aspect to it as well, which is robot warfare, drones, and unarmed ground-based weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems, which are out of purview of human control. So all these things are coming on stream if they're not there already, and we have to ask about the effects of these things on thinking about war and its justifications. Because if you have a whole fleet of unmanned autonomous weapon systems by land, sea, and air, and you point them in the direction of the enemy, what then? And could they go wrong? Could they turn around and come and zap you instead, and so forth? But cyber war, the war in which there's constant attack on your systems and trying to crash your computers and access your data, and that goes on all the time already and has been for some time. So there's a race out there on encryption and protection of systems, and this has now got to levels of technical sophistication which are sort of beyond most people to understand exactly what's happening. But this is now well entrenched and happening for a long time.
One last question?
Could it ever be justifiable for a nation to control a narrative, even if that narrative was false? To control a narrative, to control people's perceptions, if it led to saving life, even if it wasn't entirely true?
I'm afraid the answer to that is yes, but because it has always been a common practice that propaganda, information given to the home population has been managed so as not to cause panic, as to encourage people, to reassure the population, to misinform the enemy. I mean, this is a standard technique. Loose talk costs lives. You may remember those things that posters that went up in the Second World War. So this is management of perceptions, is management of emotions. And we all think, for example, how doughty and sterling the British population was under the Blitz. In fact, it's not true. There was a lot of problems, a lot of panic, trying to stop people from leaving London, while the Blitz was on. But didn't want to have huge numbers of refugees swarming out into the countryside and overwhelming villages and towns. I mean, there were some difficulties like that. And yet today, even today, we will look back on that and say, You know, think about those broadcasts, Big Ben chiming, and this is London calling, and people listening, you know. Which people think now how brave we were and how we stood up for it. And I suppose we did in one way, but in other ways it was sometimes pretty touch and go. And our perceptions today have been managed successfully by the way they were managed then. So you're absolutely right about it. Management of perceptions, management of emotions, management of information, of what people know, what they see, is tremendously important. And actually it has a downside, which is this. Almost all the major news services of the world, BBC, ITN, CNN, all these, ABC News, they don't broadcast pictures onto our television screens of what it actually looks like in a place of conflict, of what casualties actually look like and what's actually happening on the ground. They tend to be highly edited, you know, to save people's horror. And in a way that's a pity, because if people did see what it was really like, maybe sentiment about conflict would be different.
So sorry, Professor, I know you've got to get on your way. I know that I speak on behalf of all of Defence Humanists, and I thank you sincerely for being so generous with your time to come down here to the Hampshire countryside and provide us with such a thought-provoking talk. So I'm sure you'd all like to join me once again. Thank you, Professor, for coming back.
Thank you very much.